Art Nerds! Today we're going to be talking about figure construction for comics and constructive figure drawing. So this is a follow-up video to my constructive figure drawing demonstration. I'm going to explain things in a little bit more detail and show you guys some salient real-world examples, as well as do a little bit of demonstration. This is part of my prep for my Nashville Community Education Comics class. So if you've come here through that, welcome. And if you guys have any questions, please do let me know in the comments below, particularly if there's something I haven't quite demonstrated well enough or something that needs to be explained a little bit more in depth. So for those of you who are not familiar with constructive figure drawing, it's simply a method of constructing the figure using various techniques, and every artist has their own set of techniques or set of skills that they use in order to construct figures. This allows me to not only reproduce characters over and over again consistently, but it also allows me to pose these characters in a variety of ways, either using reference or using my knowledge of human anatomy. So generally when I'm planning an illustration or a comic page, I begin with thumbnails. And I have examples here on this channel of various methods of doing thumbnails. These are some thumbnails for an upcoming commission. So this is going to be a standalone illustration. And as you guys can see, they're very quick, very sketchy stick figures. It's really just enough for me to understand the posing of the characters and the motion of the characters. Often with thumbnails, I will take these because I have trouble kind of reproducing the liveliness when I redraw things. I'll take these and I'll either photograph them or I'll scan them, and then I'll blow them up in Photoshop and start tightening from there. But that isn't the only way that I work from sketches and from thumbnails. Often, if I have an idea for an illustration, I'll begin sketching it directly in either non-photo blue or pink lead. These are very erasable leads that allow me to do a little bit of exploration, a little bit of figuring out in a pencil stage without committing and without ruining the paper. So you see here, I have a little sketch of Kara running away from Pancake. Everything is still really loose. Everything is still really gestural. Nothing has really been tightened out, but you still can get a feel for the characters, a feel for the movement, and a feel for the setting. This is important because I might have a very intense idea of inspiration, but that only lasts for a few seconds at best. And really my best chance of completing a successful illustration, even if it's just a sketch, is to get it down on paper as quickly as possible before I forget. I can't walk around with an idea in my head for an hour because it becomes diluted over time. So even a really quick, rough sketch helps me capture the idea in a way that I can revisit later. But a common element of these sketches is I begin with sort of a very loose skeletal form. This way I can capture the pose, but I'm not committed to the pose. I can make changes as I go along. Everything is still really loose and just sketched out. This allows me to refine as I go without wasting a lot of time. This is a method I cannot recommend enough to other artists. Don't get committed to your drawing before you've fully figured it out. Even if it's just a sketch, just an idea, the looser you stay in the beginning stages, the more the ideas will come to you. Some of them are even looser than that. This is an idea I had while on a trip of a little girl meeting a mermaid. I'm going to flesh this idea out for you guys in another video, but I wanted to show you just how really loose and sketchy this is, yet it still conveys the idea. So we're at our thumbnails for the upcoming commission again. One of the things I needed to do for this commission was I needed to redesign the characters a bit. And what I have here is actually a really interesting sort of onion skin view. A lot of people would do this digitally. I usually do it traditionally. And this is a great opportunity for me to show you how I think, because I actually did this in stages using tracing paper and vellum. So I begin with the skeletal form. This is just to get the proportions of the character down. I begin by fleshing out the actual physical proportions so we can figure out how tall, how thin, the ratios, body weight, etc. Then I start sketching out the clothing, what this character is going to wear. And I do this on subsequent layers, and that way I can just scrap the whole the whole page if I don't like it without losing all my progress. And I have a video on character design using colored leads that goes into this a little bit more in depth. And then I have the base character design. You see, I fleshed out the clothing, I've sketched in the face, and then since he's wearing glasses, sometimes I have difficulty drawing glasses properly, so I went ahead and I used a transparent Post-it note, a vellum Post-it note, just to do the glasses. So as you guys can see, my character sketches and designs develop over layers or over stages. And this is the method that really works best for me. It's the method I've used for several years. This is a way for me to remember human anatomy, human proportions, without having to memorize a lot of information that I'm not necessarily going to use. I'm a children's comic artist, so I don't really draw a lot of shirtless people. I don't really draw a lot of nudity other than when I'm doing figure studies. So while that information is good to know, it isn't relevant for my day-to-day drawings, and it doesn't factor into most of my day-to-day drawings. Here is another example, the other character from that upcoming commission. And they're actually based off of one of my mermaids, a newt child. So for this, I've taped some of these down a little bit more, and I don't think they are in quite as many stages. And I just tape it down to keep it from getting destroyed in my sketchbook since I do travel fairly frequently. So for this one, I actually skipped the skeletal form and I just started sketching in the proportions. So you can see this child is shorter, has stockier limbs, has wider hips. By using this method, you can really vary it to suit your characters. You don't have to be tied to anything in particular. And also, this method can be great for drawing animals, and I'm going to demonstrate that in another video. So here I designed the child's face and the markings since they are a fire-bellied newt. And then here I tightened everything up and designed the child's clothing. So your stages can be a little bit more flexible. You don't have to design everything at a particular stage. It doesn't have to go skeletal structure, constructive figure drawing, facial anatomy, and then clothing. You can kind of design as the ideas come to you. It can also be helpful to do a little sketch on the side just so that you keep your ideas handy. Some of us are more visual learners after all. Here's another example of a thumbnail. As you guys can see, this is really, really loose. I designed the characters' pose, their hair, and their clothing, and not really much else. But this is just a reminder of an idea for me that I can revisit later. This is another example, and in another video, I'm going to flesh this out for you guys as well. As you can see, this character here has much more cartoony proportions. Constructive human anatomy can be used for basically any kind of character design you want to do. It's not limited to realistic. It works really well for cartoony. It's just a method of keeping things consistent, and it allows you to move the form not only through space, so it does give you an idea of the perspective, but it also allows you to pose the form consistently and realistically. And here is another example of a figure that's been done in multiple stages using tracing paper. And it's just really simple. You just tape it as you go. You can also do this in Photoshop or Clip Studio Paint or Metabang Paint by just adding layers on top of it. With those, I recommend you start with lighter colors and set your layers to multiply so you can actually see what you're doing. So here we have two figures posed together, a father and a child. So we start with the skeletal sketch. This is really just a gesture for the ideas to figure out how they're interacting. In the constructive form, I actually changed the figure dynamic a little bit just so that it actually looks like he's holding the child. I also used a piece of Post-it note to redesign her arm. And then finally, I tightened everything up. I sketched in not only the clothes, but the hair and the faces. These are characters I've drawn a lot. It's actually Kara when she was younger and her father. So these are characters I'm fairly familiar with. And it's not like I was searching for their character designs. If I was trying to figure out or hash out their character designs, there would either be another layer of tracing paper or I might even utilize Post-its. Really, when you're doing traditional drawing, it doesn't have to be pretty. It just needs to be functional, and it just needs to be functional and understandable for you or whoever you're working with. So I'm going to revisit the skeletal structures that I introduced in my Constructive Human Anatomy demo. And we're just going to do some basic figure drawings using the skeletons. If you would like to see an in-depth demonstration of how to draw these skeletons, I really recommend you check out Andrew Loomis's figure drawing for all it's worth. There are several explanations and demonstrations of how to do these skeletal forms and the proportions for these skeletal forms, and I use them frequently as the basis for most of my drawings. So I really recommend you use that as a starting point, especially if you're trying to capture gesture. So for this demonstration, since I'm going to be talking as I'm drawing, I actually have pulled up some reference. And this can also be a great way to become more comfortable with doing figure drawing and gesture drawing, is pull up reference and just practice your skeletal forms. I also have a tutorial where I show you guys how to do sort of gestural silhouettes. I highly recommend doing those exercises as well. The more practice you put in, the better you're going to get at this. So I start with my line of action. Sketch in my shoulders. I haven't really left enough room for both arms. Now for me, when I'm doing the skeletal form, I don't quite do the Loomis skeletal form. I kind of introduce a little bit of Glenn Vilppu, where I use kind of a rectangle to indicate the torso, and that's helps me better judge the mass of the torso. I have a really short torso. I'm kind of a little potato person. So I have a tendency to draw my torsos too short always. Doing this helps me consistently block it out. So I just recommend it. And then we're gonna do an egg for the rib cage, line of motion across the bust, and then we're gonna sketch in the pelvis. And since we're drawing from reference, this person is actually fairly squat in comparison to what some of you guys might draw for your comics. Most real humans are about 6 heads tall. This is something from the 20s, so I would guess she's about 5 heads. So we have our basic gestural sketch. I'll do another one since there's a really lovely side view. And if you don't feel like you've quite captured the gesture to begin with, you can always redraw. You can redraw it in another color. You can put some tracing paper on top of it. So it looks like she's actually pregnant from the side view. So that's when this sort of rectangular shape can actually be really useful. Now we can better see that her leg is lifted. So I have here 2 skeletal views of the same person. Now we're going to go ahead, use a darker color, and start doing some constructive human anatomy on top of it. And like I explained in my demonstration video, what I mostly use are spheres and cylinders to help develop forms. And I cannot say enough that reading, practicing, copying the exercises, and then replicating the exercises from reference is the best way to learn how to do this. Watching people do it, working through it as they're doing it, that's really the best way to learn. I mean, that's how most art schools teach it. That's really the most recommended method. That's how Disney Studio used to teach drawing to their artists. They would do like weekly sessions. In fact, I really recommend you guys read Walt Stanchfield's Drawn to Life Volume 1 and 2. There's a lot in there that you can learn. People kind of underestimate cartoony art styles. But really, to be good at doing cartoony things, you have to at least be proficient with doing more realistic things. Cartoony is an abstraction or an abstract version, a simplification of realism. So it's not necessarily easier once you understand what you're doing. It's just a different method of interpreting that information. That's why I am frustrated when people tell me their art teachers won't let them draw cartoony things, because it's like, if you can demonstrate that you're competent with drawing from reference, then I would think the next logical step is interpreting that into your own format, and I would think they would value that. But you can take it from somebody who holds an MFA in art and a BA in art as well, that cartoony is not less. In fact, drawing from reference is actually fairly easy. Interpreting what you see is harder. And even at this stage, even though I'd sketched everything out, I'm kind of tightening some things, refining some things. Okay, so that is figure 1. We're going to do the same now for figure 2. And I've noticed that for figure 2, her arm is kind of low. So I'm actually going to adjust it as I construct it. And as you guys can see, things are drawn and fleshed out in stages. I haven't drawn her face, I haven't drawn her hair, I haven't drawn her clothes. I'm really just trying to get the gesture solid. I'm also keeping my movements loose and sort of flowy. There's nothing particularly angular about how I'm drawing. You can approach the figure from angles. There are artists who do that. But for me, a more organic, flowing sort of figure is generally my preference. Okay, so we have both figures sketched. I'm going to switch over now to red, and I'm just going to start sketching in her clothes and her face. And in order to become proficient, to get good at figure drawing, I really recommend that you do 15 minutes of figure study every day. And don't get discouraged if you're not particularly good in the beginning. This is something that really requires a lot of practice. And also check out how other artists approach figure drawing, because if my method doesn't work for you, someone else's method might work better. I know that when I found the Glenville Pooh drawing manual, it was like somebody had turned a light on in my brain, because I had taken a couple years of figure drawing as part of my undergraduate degree, and it really wasn't clicking, and it really wasn't understanding. I wasn't understanding, and I was really struggling with it. And it wasn't until I'd read the Glenville Pooh drawing manual and I had figure drawing taught in a more constructive way that things began to click for me. And then I ended up taking Constructive Human Anatomy while at SCAD because I enjoyed it so much. So even people with cartoony styles can benefit from learning how a figure is constructed. And Glenville Pooh used to work for Disney and used to be one of their instructors. So that, I mean, if that's not a pedigree for some of you guys, to be able to teach people how to animate forms in a reproducible way that others can be able to take your stills and your keyframes and animate from there, you know, I think that really speaks volumes to the quality of what's being taught and to the quality of how the information is presented. I still didn't get that arm high enough because it should be, well, it should, her head should be down lower and the arm should be up slightly higher. So we're going to do another And when I'm drawing, I like drawing figures in motion because that's something that I know my figures tend to come off as really stiff. So I like drawing people in yoga poses. I like drawing acrobats. I like drawing ballerinas, that sort of stuff, just because it's something I really struggle with. Now, let's see. Sometimes when you look at poses in motion, like there's a site figures in motion, basically the in-between poses look kind of strange. And if you're doing comics, you wouldn't necessarily pick an in-between pose because you want the gesture to read as clear as possible. That's something that's really very beneficial though for, say, animators, because it gives you like a clean idea of what the movements look like. And I'm also trying to find, I guess we'll do another woman. I was hoping to do a man, but I wanted a dynamic enough pose and enough clothing on the figure that we can go over clothing the figure again. And I'm gonna go over all of these steps more in detail in future videos. But I really don't think I could do it any better than Glenn Villepeu. So I really do recommend that if you like what you're seeing, if you think this is a viable method of figure drawing for you, I really recommend you check out his work and check out his stuff on YouTube, because he has a lot of beautiful demonstrations. So I began with my line of action as well as my rectangular form, and I've already begun with like the push and the pull. This is going to help with dynamics where you have things curving in. You also want to have a long, smooth curve. So you basically want to pattern your curves so that they never end at the same place. Otherwise, you get kind of lumpy sausage looking stuff. So the egg for the rib cage. And it's okay to draw the same thing multiple times as you understand the form, as you understand the gesture. In fact, that's one of the ways you can improve, is redrawing things as you better understand it, because your brain often, many people's brains, I don't want to speak for everyone, but most brains learn through repetition. So the more you practice something and you improve on it and you critique yourself and you look for areas that need improvement, the better you're going to get, the more you're going to remember it. So maybe for the first week, if you're doing concentrated figure study where you're learning how to do constructive human anatomy and you're drawing 15 minutes a day, maybe you should start with the same figure every day and self-critique. I know that can get boring for some people, but it's a really good way to isolate areas of weakness and improve upon them. So I have the basic skeletal figure with there's a lot of dynamism, there's a lot of fluid movement. All of my limbs have curves to them. I find that as I tighten up my figures, things become really stiff. So I try to overemphasize, like I should move her leg back a little bit more so we get this really nice full curve. And this is a really nice pose because we actually get a lot of bounce, a lot of movement. Tighten up her arms just a little bit. So now we have sort of the basics of our skeleton. Now it's time to kind of tighten this up. And if you notice you're having difficulty drawing a particular part of the body, draw it over and over and over and over again. Find it in different positions, find it in different genders. Just repeat, draw it from a skeletal form. And, you know, even professional artists, even seasoned artists have to revisit things. They learn new things and they want to apply it into their art. So they have to go back and do a bunch of studies. That's why you'll see like those beautiful studies of hands and stuff like on Twitter and on Pinterest, is because someone decided they needed to improve how they draw their hands. So they took the time to do a bunch of hand studies. And that isn't necessarily for you to just copy, although you can definitely learn how to draw something by seeing and practicing how other people draw it, but it's for their practice. So I am kind of breaking down and constructing the head, and I'm going to do that in depth in another video for you guys, because that can be a little complicated, although once you understand the basics of it, it becomes second nature. And it's hard actually for me to draw and talk to you guys because I'm trying to think about what I'm drawing and how the forms are meshing into one another. And if I'm talking to you guys, my brain isn't processing that information. And it's okay to just rough things in as well, especially if it's kind of your exploratory phases, just so that you can understand how the basic forms mesh. I also highly recommend you don't just rely on your school to teach you how to do these things. You go out and you investigate on your own. You see what artists you admire are using. You check out what they're recommending, because UNO did not recommend the Glenville Pooh drawing manual. They didn't like that I did cartoony stuff, and they thought that was a waste of my energies. So none of my professors would ever have recommended the resource that ended up changing my life. That was me trolling internet boards in 2000, 2008, 2007, seeing what other artists recommended, reading other people's blogs, that sort of thing. Me taking my art education a step further and not being reliant on other people spoon feeding me. All right, so we have our constructed form now. She's actually wearing skin tight clothing, so the clothing portion of this is going to be very easy. I don't care for how I'm handling her face, but it doesn't really matter because it is just a sketch. If I really cared, I could put some tracing paper over this and refine it, or go grab a black pen. Or I could scan it and redraw her features in Photoshop. I mean, you really have a lot of methods for correction. And at every stage of your drawing, you can take different methods of correction. You don't have to, if you don't like how something turned out, you don't have to just live with it or try to hide it. You can actually correct it and fix it. And that's one of the things I really love about my comic making process with all the different stages, is that I have a lot of options, a lot of opportunities to correct my work and to get feedback from other artists and from other readers. So like I said, she's wearing kind of a bodysuit. It's really like a top thing with like lycra pants. And paying attention to the lines on clothing can give you a lot of cues about how the body is moving underneath. And her hands have this beautiful curved gesture to them. And basically every part of the body can have a line of motion, can have a distinct gesture. Every part of the body can be used to sort of tell your story and to push your figure. So hands and how the feet and the face, all of that can be used to really push the motion of the figure. All right, so we have demonstrated with 3 women. I am going to really challenge myself. I found an interesting picture of a break dancer. So I'm going to try and sketch him. We'll see how successful I am. This one may take some repetition, but that can be good too, because then I can actually demonstrate how the pose can improve as you refine and you reiterate. And the key there is really not to erase, because you're not turning this in for a project. It's to redraw because you're training your brain. So we begin with our triangular shape. And then sometimes when I have a view of the pelvis sort of facing up towards me, so basically you can see the person's undercarriage, I will break it down a little bit more into kind of a trapezoidal shape like this. So I'm trying to think more 3-dimensionally. And I really recommend that when you pursue figure drawing, you try to think about the figures as 3D figures that exist in space. And that's something that requires a lot of practice. So don't get discouraged if it doesn't come naturally to you. I'm really just trying to find and capture the gesture. And I'm kind of using different parts of the body as landmarks to make sure things are high enough in the air, etc. So right now he kind of looks like a weird toad dude. That's all right. We've got a gesture here. So let's work on refining it. And there are resources here on YouTube, like the Croquis Cafe. I'll pop links to everything in the description below, but there are figure drawing practice resources here on YouTube and just on the internet at large if you can't access a figure drawing class. So, same as with the female dancer, I am trying to maintain line of action and push and pull, that sort of thing. This one isn't quite as clear as it was with her because she had this big, beautiful, open gesture, and his is also open and beautiful and interesting, but it's a little more constrained. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of movement, which can be really difficult to render. Takes a lot of practice, so you may end up having to redraw things several times. All right, so I have the basic constructed pose down. I'm going to tighten it up now using some red. And while his pants are pretty tight, I guess they're like yoga style pants, you're still getting, they're not skin tight, so you're still getting a lot of interesting wrinkles and stuff that also can kind of help define the forms and help indicate, how the body is moving. Okay, so we have a completed sketch. We're gonna do one more. And this one's really nice because there's like a really clear line of action. So don't think of the rectangular form that we use to build up our torso as a rigid form. It's very flexible. It can twist, it can turn. Okay, so we have this figure, and I might tighten it up a little bit. We have this figure that has like all these interesting curves and bends and interesting straightaways. So this one's going to be fun to draw. Some of my favorites are the ones that have a little more dynamism to them. And at this stage, the intention, this is a very muscular guy that I'm drawing, but at this stage, the intention isn't necessarily to capture all those muscles. It's really just to kind of capture the basic forms and to get the basic gesture down. I think, in fact, his arm should actually be like here. I think a lot of artists get kind of bogged down in wanting to capture the musculature because that's really important to them. And then they end up with these figures that not only feel kind of disjointed, but they feel really stiff. So to me, it's more important, even if I'm not necessarily successful all the time at it, it's more important for me to capture the motion of the figure than for me to capture the muscular structure of the figure. This arm should actually be in more. And that's not to say that, the musculature isn't important if that's what you're drawing, if that's the focus of your piece, but it's important to kind of get the basics down and get everything kind of figured out where it falls on the body and what parts are crossing where, and then you can worry about the muscles. And I try to get my sketching in as quickly as possible so it feels more fluid, it feels more dynamic. And that often means I have to do a lot of corrections, but I'm okay with that. Now, if you're going to be drawing a lot of muscular figures, I really recommend you check out Bernd Hogarth's drawing books. He has a different approach to constructive anatomy that really lends itself well to muscular figures, or even to say like superhero proportion figures. And again, I'll drop a link in the description below for you guys so you can find it. And then another thing as you progress on your figure drawing journey is studying light and shadows and how they play. I'm going to switch over now back to the blue, and I'm just going to use this to kind of mark all the areas of shadow, because that is an area of figure drawing and figure study that I've been working on. And the shadow also plays a big role in understanding what the forms are doing, especially when you have a figure kind of contorted over itself. And again, this is just study, so it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to even be accurate. If you don't like how it turned out, you can trash it and move on to the next one. It's really about getting graphite or pen or whatever you're using on paper and just getting it done and doing the work and trying to learn from it. So I hope my figure drawing demonstration, my constructive human anatomy demonstration, and my explanation of how I go from very, very sketchy skeletal forms to more developed forms, I hope this was helpful, useful, and informative for you guys. If you enjoyed this video, stick around. I have many more like this planned. Everything I am showing you guys is stuff I use in my own work, and it's stuff I use in my own comics, or it's things that I was taught through SCAD or things that I've used in comics in the past. So this isn't just coming out of the ether. It's all stuff I actually do use and I highly recommend. And I think all of these techniques are fairly easy once you've put the time in, once you put the practice in, once you've trained your brain how to see these forms and how to see these shapes. So I really hope you guys are going to take 15 minutes today, 15 minutes tomorrow, 15 minutes for every day for the next week, and practice what I've shown you guys. And I really hope you're going to check out some of the books that I've recommended in this video. As a quick recap, I highly recommend Andrew Loomis's Figure Drawing for All It's Worth, the Glenn Vilppu Drawing Manual, and then Bernd Hogarth's book on Constructive Anatomy. And I will link all of those in the description below. So if there's anything you need to see covered again or explained again, let me know in the comments. I look forward to hearing back from you guys, and I hope you guys are looking forward to more videos like this in the future. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys have a great day. Bye, guys.